Hey y'all, new year, new studio, new me. Okay, same old me, but a new space. And listen, we got a lot of new great content coming your way this year, and this is the first of some really awesome insight videos that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. And let's start this off by saying when I began shooting back in 2011, I really had no concept of what made a really well exposed image beyond, sort of just looking at the LCD screen and trying to get as close as I could with what my eye saw. Now, once of course I started using more sophisticated cameras and thus using log profiles, things got even more complicated. So stop me if you've ever experienced shooting with log and then getting a noisy, muddy image. And what leaves one to wonder often is, what am I doing wrong that everybody else is doing right? Now, the goal of this video today is really just to answer that question, to give you practical log exposure advice based on a concept that you can use with any camera you end up having in your hands. And for those of you who use, say, certain cameras or you own one particular brand, well, I've brought in 6 major camera models to demonstrate this same concept. And on each one of those cameras, we're going to present what unique considerations you may need to make with each model. We're also going to both cover log encoded shooting, as well as a couple examples of using RAW. The concept I'm sharing today is not a hard and fast rule. It is only a basis of understanding. Ultimately, every situation requires a unique approach, and it's really up to you to take this information and do tests with your own camera. Additionally, we're also going to be diving into the grade to see how these effects play out after we've recorded the image, and what approaches or considerations we may need to make. And for this, I am going to be using DaVinci Resolve. Now, if you are a video shooter, then I really highly recommend that you get Resolve and you learn to do even just the most basic color grading. While you may never need to color your own work, by learning to grade, you are going to understand exposure better and hand off better files to your production. And that, my friends, is going to make you infinitely more valuable in your role. And if you believe that color grading is really not something DPs do, well, that's actually not true at all, because film DPs of the last nearly 100 years knew a whole lot about film processing and color timing images. So it is absolutely part of your job. And with that, let's dive in. If you are a film photographer already, you may recognize some of what I'm about to tell you. And we'll begin by exploring how digital exposure is adapted from how we expose film. This concept gives us a global insight into the properties of light and how we assemble and control that light during acquisition, development, and delivery. And listen, you can certainly skip this section, but it plays a huge role in the exposure approach I'm going to teach you. So you can certainly take the one free fish, but it's probably better that you learn to fish for yourself. There are 2 types of color film stocks in the world: color negative, that's the one you're most likely familiar with, and reversal film, also known as slide film, which creates a positive image. When the color negative film starts its life inside of the camera, the film stock is clear. As light hits the film, the silver halide crystals react to the light and darken, and that's going to pull the color dye clouds around them. The more light, the darker the negative. Color reversal film works the opposite way. It starts its life as opaque and changes to clear with exposure. For the simplicity of today's concept, we will be referring to terminology around the use of color negative film. There's a term in film photography that is called image density. Now, I cannot speak for the origin of this term or its scientific definition, but most commonly we use this to describe how opaque a developed film image is. The darker the negative, the denser it is. This is important to note because most negative film stocks behave very much like log profiles, whereas color reversal film behaves very similarly to Rec. 709, and that is not purely coincidence. And it's not that they necessarily share similar technologies, it's just the intent or use case is very similar. And I'll provide a link in the description below if you're interested in more on that topic. The most vital concept to understand in this video is that, generally speaking, color negative film can handle a very large range of overexposure. How much? Well, that's dependent on each film stock, but the acceptable range is about 3 stops over, and in many cases up to 6 stops over, but at that point, undesired color shifts can often occur. Knowing that we can push 3 more stops gives us a lot more control over the image. Now, if you're wondering about the term push or push and pull, let me explain that for those who may not be familiar. They are film terms. What they mean is, in the exposure side, if you are pushing your film, you are overexposing your film, and in the lab, you're now going to have to pull that exposure back. That is called a pull process. In the reverse of that, you can now pull your film back in exposure, and then you're going to push the film stock up in the process. So push process and pushing, two different things. Got it? The log image encoding that we see today was originally called CINEON, and it was developed by Kodak to scan film with the purpose of creating a two-way mathematical function that would remain true to the original negative, meaning you could take this log profile and reverse it to print and answer print with absolute mathematical accuracy. It also exploits the full dynamic range of the film so that we can make any necessary or artistic corrections in the film timing. If you want to know more about why log image encoding exists and why we do it, again, links in the description below, because further conversation is well beyond the scope of this video. So in simplest terms, the concept I'm discussing today is consistently overexposing your log footage. Now, to some of you, this might sound terrifying, and to others, well, you may already do it, but perhaps you just don't know what you can or can't get away with. And that, my friends, is where this video comes in. Regardless of your shooting scenario, I'm going to show you a simple way to get the very best image and exposure every time, regardless of camera. Before we dive into each camera, I'm going to teach you, globally speaking, my approach. For most of our samples today, we are looking at waveform monitors. And with certain cameras, we're also going to be using false color. Most cameras, it's worth noting, also have zebras, and those can be adapted to this technique as well. And I'd also like to mention that false color and zebras are actually more accurate in the camera than waveforms. But for today, I'm actually less concerned about accuracy. I'm more concerned about your comprehension. And the reason will become apparent momentarily. When working with 10-bit or higher signal, we will be viewing a 32-bit float waveform. These are data levels measured in steps from 0 to 1023. Now, you may be tempted to call this the IRE scale, but IRE is 8-bit and goes from 1 to 100. These two scales, though, are roughly correlated with each other, which is why we are often expressing our exposure steps in percentages, not in 10-bit data levels. When you're looking at a 709 image, your gray card should land you somewhere around 409 in the video range or 415 in the data range. On an 8-bit IRE scale, that number is anywhere in the bracket of 48 to 52%. The waveform monitor represents the pixel luminance across the frame, so left to right. So a person in the center of the frame will be referenced in the center of the waveform monitor. As we change our exposure by any means, we will see that waveform increase or decrease and often change shape as well. The waveform shape will correspond directly to the image profile we're shooting in, or simply converting to. For today's video, we're going to focus, of course, on log and Rec. 709. So how do you know the shape and the position that our image should take in the waveform monitor? In other words, how do we use the waveform monitor to expose our image? Well, each brand's proprietary log curve, like ARRILOG-C, Sony S-Log, etc., will have an accompanying white paper. Now, this is a technological paper that lists the properties of the gamma curve. The most important information to glean from this is where the 18% middle gray point falls and the 90% white point. Each log profile will have slightly different correlating numbers, and they will give you those plot points by either the 32-bit float scale or the IRE percentage. If you see these exposure points represented in IRE, it is because of simplicity. We're just simply not very good at talking about 10-bit numbers. 8-bit IRE numbers are effectively percentages. Thus, it's easier to visualize quite quickly. The important thing to note here is that despite this, log has never been designed for 8-bit cameras. It requires at least a 10-bit signal. And I discussed this many times over several videos. And despite some 8-bit cameras actually allowing you to shoot log, do not shoot log with 8-bit. I mean, do what you want. It's your funeral, kid. If you want to be scientifically accurate with your exposure, you simply take a gray card and align it with your key light. You line up the gray card in your waveform monitor with the gray point for your log profile, listed within the white paper. A simple Rec. 709 LUT will then remap all your values to their appropriate 709 value, either in post or in your reference monitor. Thus, it should be nearly identical to an image had you just recorded to Rec. 709 in the first place. And we're done. Good night. Except that we're not. Here's the problem. If you expose to the manufacturer's white paper values, you will most often end up with a somewhat problematic image. You see, because log works by compressing highlight information. Thus, if I change my exposure, what you will see is that while the values below middle gray are affected, the values above do not really seem to change shape. In the white paper exposure, the whole of the image exists in the bottom 60% of the waveform, really as a way to retain as much highlight range as possible. By having so much of the image so low in exposure, it kind of also makes it buddy cop to the noise floor. And sensors, by their nature, due to voltage, heat, among other things, make noise. The signal-to-noise ratio is really how much signal do I have in relation to how much noise my sensor gives out. So if they are too close together, then raising one raises the other. What effect does overexposing have on an image? Well, if the image information was much further away, as in higher up the waveform, the ratio would be much higher because you have a lot more signal relative to the noise. Lower exposure levels really just get you a lower noise ratio because they kind of live in the same neighborhood. So let's take a look at this in practical terms. Here's a scene we shot with all cameras. Now we're going to zoom into the image on every single camera we used, and I'm going to show you its white paper waveform levels. Pause the video here if you need to examine any of this a little bit more closely. Let's now convert to Rec. 709 with a conversion LUT. And boom, look at all that chroma noise. If we zoom out, it obviously becomes far less apparent. So depending on your viewing angle and audience, this may be completely passable. However, if you've been frustrated by this in the past and you want a cleaner image, well, we just need to put some space between the noise floor and your image information. But that's not all, my friends, because even if the level of noise was, say, acceptable to you, well, you are still cheating yourself. Because modern imagers are so powerful and packed with so much information that exposing to white paper levels is really just leaving a lot of the image on the table, notably in the shadows. Now let's say I felt my image was too dark or I wanted more shadow detail. Well, again, raising the exposure in post will only raise the noise floor more. Though what's even worse is that so little of the shadow information was recorded in the first place. So you're most likely just going to end up with milky blacks and not much else. By overexposing our log image, most of what we are doing is simply opening up everything below middle gray. The highlight compression of log gives us the power to blow past that white point of 60%. Now, depending on your camera and your sensor, this can be anywhere from 2 to 6 or more stops over. Here's some examples of shooting an overexposure with the native camera's ISO, and we're going to compare that to the white paper exposure. Even the RAW recording cameras and the lauded ARRI Alexa LF both benefit greatly by overexposure, significantly less noise, and more detailed shadow range when overexposing. So let's wrap up this little explanatory section by playing a little imagination game. Let's look at that waveform again. Now imagine what you're looking at isn't a waveform at all, but a microscopic side view of a film negative. Right now, all of your light information is in this thin little region of the negative. But as I flood the film with more light, more of that film gets exposed. The negative is getting denser. Now you have a visual and a digital representation of a dense negative. You can literally see information appearing where it hadn't before. Thus, regardless of what camera I'm shooting on, I like to just fire up the old waveform monitor and push my exposure with my lens, lighting, or shutter angle to get me a nice, healthy, dense-looking negative. I don't necessarily need to know where even the gray point is. I just have to make sure that my highlights never clip. This does create an obvious problem, though, which is on-set monitoring. You have two options here. One is to explain to your director or client that this is a mechanical process and that it will look great in the finished product. You can even show them the log image just to abate any panic from them. In a hurry, of course, this will maybe work, but for obvious reasons, not at all ideal. The best thing to do is to build compensation LUTs for your camera. And here's how you're going to do that. To start off, ideally you're going to shoot camera tests with a human being and a gray card at the full range of exposures that your camera can handle. Now, I didn't have a human on the day that I shot these, but I did have a camera line chart, so good enough. Number two, you are going to meter with your waveform monitor or false color. As I mentioned earlier, false color will be a little bit more accurate. Now what you're going to do is record all of your exposure levels above your white paper level. So as many stops over as your camera can handle. When you're changing your exposure though, make sure that you're changing it with the lighting, the lens, or the shutter. Park your ISO at its native ISO because when you move your ISO, you're remapping the gray point. And we're going to talk a lot more about that coming up. Next thing you can do is bring all of these files into Resolve, working with DaVinci Resolve YRGB color space. I'm specifically not recommending color managed for simplicity. Once in Resolve and you've brought your footage into a timeline, we are going to set up our node tree with two nodes. You're going to name the first one Exposure or Compensation. And the second one you're going to name LUT or 709. Next, you're going to calibrate your waveform monitor. Add the gray and white point reference lines for your specific log profile. You may also want to use a false color plugin if you like. The next step is to start with the white paper exposure. Ensuring that your exposure lines up with the reference lines, you're now going to apply the official Rec. 709 conversion LUT to the second node. The LUT should remap everything, so it's generally plug and play, but sometimes it doesn't. And if this is the case, adjust exposure in your first node so that your gray point lines up to step 473. You may also want to pull down some more highlights at this point just to soften the monitoring image a little bit. Next, we are now going to grab a still of this image and name it reference. You will now repeat this process for your other exposures. In the exposure node, use offset to pull the exposure down to the white paper levels. Then add the 709 LUT. Compare the reference image. If it needs adjustment, return to your first node to realign with offset, then lift gamma gain to match the black, gray, and white points. And if you want to build a creative look on top of this, well, this is the time to do it, and this is where you're going to do it, by just simply adding the creative adjustments to another before or before parallel node. One note before we go any further, there is another way to do this within DaVinci Resolve, and that is through a color space transform. A CST is really just a scene-referred color transform, and as such, I don't completely recommend using this for creating offset LUTs, except if maybe you just need more dynamic range to make a custom look. A LUT is going to require much less work because a CST function works differently and also clamps the gain fairly aggressively. Thus, this process is really best left for grading, especially if you don't have much color grading experience. Though, if you are CST curious, my best approach thus far has been, first, like with a LUT, I adjust my offset. Then I go into my highlight fader and bring that up. I'm going to now counter that with gamma down. Some other successful parameters for me have been manipulating the contrast and pivot, as well as using curves. Once you're ready to export the LUT, right-click on the file in the color page timeline and select Generate LUT. Take a note of the grid size that your camera is capable of handling. The safest is to choose 17 or 33 grid for standard definition displays. And finally, you're just going to save and import into your camera. Let's now move on to part 2 and our camera samples. +5, +5. Now as we move over to our image acquisition devices, we are going to focus solely on navigating the brand or model specific experience. As I'm sure you know, not all cameras are created equal either. Some have much more dynamic range than others, better highlight roll-off, or a cleaner noise response. You really need to know the camera that you are using, both its strengths and weaknesses, and then expose accordingly. You may also look at the footage from each camera and be tempted to see this as an image quality or exposure test. It is not. I am making no comments on any of that. This is a process demonstration only. I've made no efforts to beautify the image. It is simply a scene with a range of light values and a skin tone reference. In our scene, you will be directed to look at the following things: shadow areas with a variety of gradients, a hot highlight area, which is going to be bright enough that it will intentionally limit how much we can overexpose our image, and thus allow us to see how much highlight range each camera has, a skin tone reference, and finally a DSC Labs Gamma line chart, which I'm using to provide graphical representation of our gamma curve. It is set back from the key, so it'll always appear on the waveform as underexposed by a stop or two. The following section is divided by brand, but in some cases, also a bonus concept. So at this point, please feel free to jump to any camera model or topic most relevant to you. We're going to start with the Panasonic EVA-1, which has been actually one of my favorite cameras to use over the years. I really love its organic feel and color mapping. The same V-Log is also found in the S-Series full-frame cameras, so you should arrive at very similar results if those are the cameras you're using. The EVA-1's waveform monitor is quite small, and thus you may have a harder time being accurate. So with this camera, I really do recommend a separate monitor with bigger scopes or false color, like the Atomos Ninja I'm using here. The EVA-1 is also a camera in the lineup that has what I perceive to be the least dynamic range of all the cameras that we have. But it's also the oldest camera in the lineup, so, once we bring it into Resolve, you can clearly see the better dynamic range and control that you get when comparing to the overexposed sample. If we go to our curves, we can achieve a cleaner black with more subtle gradation in the shadow tones and superior color mapping. This means we can change the contrast without negatively affecting the fidelity of the image. From a usability standpoint, Canon is honestly one of the best, with a nice, clear waveform monitor. Canon also offers false color, which I cover in the Arri Alexa, Red Komodo, and Blackmagic section. There are 3 flavors of C-Log, of which I find the 2 most used are C-Log 2 and C-Log 3. C-Log 2 offers the greatest dynamic range, and C-Log 3 a slightly cleaner image. Most shooters do prefer the range of the C-Log 2, which is why I'm choosing this log profile today. C-Log 2 really doesn't like to be underexposed in any scenario, but particularly in higher ISOs, for the obvious reasons we already talked about, because you've bought a bunch of this highlight range at the cost of the gray point being closer to the noise floor. In the white paper exposure, the noise is most apparent in the lower mid-range. Thus, it will be easier to take out the noise with reduction if you're just keying by luminance. By the way, I do also find this to be the case at C-Log 3 as well, despite what I just said a moment ago about C-Log 3 being cleaner. It is, but not like drastically. Overexposure is really critical with any variety of C-Log, in my opinion. And for those of you who are tempted to alter exposure with your ISO, and I told you we talk about this, I wanted to show an example of why you may or may not wish to do that. You should be able to clearly see the effect in the highlight dynamic range when going from 800 to 3200 ISO. Below gray expands, thus giving you higher contrast, while above gray gets compressed, giving you more range. Let's leave the world of Canon just for a second and head over to Arri's white paper on the topic. Arri says, when the lens is stopped down by 1 stop, for example, the EI setting is increased from, say, 800 to 1600, the sensor will capture 1 more stop of highlight information. Since the log C output represents scene exposure values, the maximum value increases. This is not only true with Arri, but with every sensor and log curve. And when changing your exposure rating on film stock as well. By increasing your exposure index over your base ISO, you increase the amount of values above middle gray. It would go against conventional thinking then that in a very bright environment, you would want to drive your ISO down. But this is the time to drive it up, when you need as much highlight information as possible. When changing your exposure, I do have a triage list that I work with, which is, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to change your exposure externally in your lighting. Next, a really good set of neutral density filters will help you sort of go plus or minus in your exposure. Third is you're going to change with shutter angle or your f-stop, prioritizing whichever effect is really most important, such as motion blur or depth of field. And then only use ISO when you fully understand how your gamma curve is being remapped. The point I'd like to make is that Sony doesn't call their waveform monitor a waveform monitor. It is called a video signal monitor, and it's even worse than the one found in the EVA1. Thus, again, if accuracy is important to you, a separate monitor is something I really recommend. S-Log 3 is also a very aggressive log curve. It is one of the flattest in business, and thus often is one of the most difficult to grade. The advantage, like Canon C-Log 2 though, is that it offers a fantastic amount of dynamic range. The Sony FX9, along with most Sony cinema cameras, do feature a dual ISO. Thus, if you are starved for light throughout your scene, the better choice here is to go with the higher base ISO to maintain an even dynamic range and better noise management. The LXLF does not have waveforms, but it does have false color. For white paper, very simply just get the green to fill the gray card and you are good to go. For overexposure levels, you can set your false color to log C based and then just go as high as you are comfortable going until you start to see red clipping, and then just back it off. You can also switch to monitor based and then with your exposure compensation LUTs, get the image to match the usual Rec 709 levels. One of the key reasons that the Alexa is the #1 production camera in filmmaking is its massive dynamic range and codec, which allows you to kind of screw up the image and get most of it, if not all of it, back. But even with $100,000 cameras, the difference in signal to noise ratio when overexposing is absolutely outstanding. Going from 3 to 5 stops over nearly eliminates chroma noise altogether. Alexa footage is also the easiest to grade of all cameras in the lineup. With overexposure, it's a simple compensation. Offset, then lift, then adjust gray point with gamma. This is also why post-production loves Arri. The most expensive camera, as I see it, is tending to correlate with how fast it is to work with both in production and in post. Now, this isn't always true, but I find it's true 90% of the time. Red Strength is their non-native ISO sensor and their compressed R3D RAW codec. Now with Red RAW, your image quality is retained within the full flexibility of the sensor. That, however, does not mean that you can just adjust it later and expect a noiseless image. The sensor is still very much like film stock, so even though we are shooting RAW and not, say, a processed codec, we are still subject to signal-to-noise ratio. And we can clearly see how, under normal exposure settings, we are still left with a very noisy image, which we can absolutely fix well enough with noise reduction, but that is going to come at a cost of your computer's processor and export times. The better choice here is to still overexpose to the point where the overexposure traffic lights are not yet illuminated. This means that you're flooding your sensor with light and expanding the distance between your information and the sensor's noise floor. With this, you achieve an image as clean as the regular exposure with noise reduction, but without losing detail and no tax on your computer system. Red's own advice from their website states, in general, minor underexposure is acceptable and recoverable, whereas minor overexposure sometimes is not. Many therefore err on the side of less light in order to protect against highlight clipping. Now this is absolutely true, but it can mislead you into thinking that you should err to underexposure. Red goes further in their exposure guide by saying, some advocate a strategy called expose to the right, whose central principle is to record as much light as possible without clipping, causing the histogram to appear shifted to the far right. While this approach works well with stills photography, it greatly increases the likelihood of clipped highlights with the video footage, since lighting conditions are often more dynamic. Okay, Dale, you say, Red disagrees with you. Well, not entirely. They're not wrong. If you push your overexposure too high, you do run the risk that something even brighter is going to come along while shooting, and then you're going to be over the clipping threshold. The best advice on this, again, comes from Red. The goal is to strike an optimal balance between the disadvantages of too little and too much light, and therefore between noise and clipping. What you're going to want to do is use these stoplights. Do not just go by the histogram. The histogram is just image encoding, but the traffic lights are actual sensor data. So use false color and pay attention to any areas that are yellow or red. Red false color is unrecoverable, so protect your image from any chance something will be red. Shadow information is recoverable even if the black level lights are on, but the same is not true for highlights. One further note is that moving the ISO on your Red camera has zero effect on the recorded image. I'll explain in a second, other than forcing you to over or underexpose. If you move the ISO, you will see that the histogram does not change. Only your monitor LUT does. The effect of moving your ISO on the Red camera does, though, have the same effect as with all other cameras, in which your gray point moves around, and Red shows you this in their exposure guide. So to summarize, with the Red cameras, you want to push your exposure as much as you're willing to while ensuring that no highlights with texture in your scene will ever clip. In order for Blackmagic to get around Red's internal RAW patent, they had to create their own version of RAW, which is sort of a shell game in the debarriering process. They also have a dual gain sensor in some of their cameras. Thus, you have RAW at 400 ISO and RAW at 3200 ISO in the 6K model that we're using here. Unlike Red, once you choose an ISO, you are locked into its gain bracket. The lower ISO will only get you up to 1000, whereas the upper ISO will allow you to choose and post anywhere from 1250 and up. Now I chose to shoot at 800 because the dynamic range is still a little bit more even there, and the lighting in our scene was already set for all the other cameras shooting at 800 ISO. For the higher ISO, I chose 3200. As with the Red, there are no waveforms on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras, but there is false color, and I used false color in conjunction with my Atomos waveform monitor. Anytime that you can have 1 or 2 or 3 points of reference, the better, the more accurate you're going to be, and the more calm you might be as well. Again, when performing overexposure, I like the waveform monitor because it's the only tool that shows me the shape of what my entire gamma curve is doing, not just certain levels. Looking at the image in post, as with all the other cameras, doing a color space transform gives you a much nicer highlight roll-off and control. Okay, that's all the cameras, but before we wrap up, I feel the need to express some caveats. First off, a colorist, professionally speaking, I am not. Do not take any lessons home from how I set up the grade, saving for creating compensation LUTs, which I think are pretty rock solid. Some colorists use waveforms, where others use histograms and vector scopes. There are many ways of achieving a grade. My way is just one, discussing how I grade and why, far beyond the scope of this video. Still, there are some mysteries surrounding color space transforms regarding how it clamps the gain. No professional colorist that I spoke to could explain it either, but they did recognize that it was a thing. Clamping the gain also isn't necessarily a bad thing either. In fact, it gives you more control over your highlights and colors. However, if you know what's actually going on and you can provide scientific or industry links to verify your position, then I will very happily pin your comment. I'm not interested in half-cock opinions. I'm interested documented facts. Another mystery I haven't totally been able to reconcile is that in some of the situations, the overexposed image's gamma curve behaved a bit differently in post than the white paper image. Nothing concerning, but it was interesting. Again, if a colorist or a color scientist out there can speak to this, you too will get a pinned comment. So that leads into what I think might possibly be the most important caveat of this entire show, which is that despite the fact I have been shooting log and raw for the better part of a decade, and as well been a film photographer and film cinematographer in that time period as well, there are still a lot of things I don't know. And I wish I knew it all. I'm sure you wish you knew it all, but unfortunately, there's no amount of research one can do in a reasonable time period that can isolate 100% of all the facts. Use the information that I'm providing today as a launch board. Please do not take anything I say as absolute fact. I have done my best to make sure that everything that I've shown within this video is 100% accurate to the best of my knowledge, but there are a lot of gaps that I even admit I have. And sometimes that just comes from the fact that manufacturers don't release a lot of proprietary technological information. There's some missing knowledge because the manufacturers aren't providing that. That leaves the general public and the users to kind of start speculating. And then sometimes what we think is the truth is really just speculation. And then trying to get a color scientist to speak to this is also difficult. I did that a few years ago, and it was a very confusing conversation that did not help at all. So what I hope is that this, again, is just a launching pad for you guys to go and do your own research and to do your own tests and to see the results and know where the limits of those results are. As I kind of just said, there are some issues about when we go higher up in that overexposure, some things in certain cameras start to happen. And that's we saw in film as well, where if you go too far in the exposure, yes, you can pull back the luminance and that information is all there, but color starts to shift. So again, user beware, know the limits of your camera and know what it's capable of doing so that you don't ruin your images. There are some external factors as well that can affect the dynamic range and color rendition of your camera sensor, namely the lights that you're using. If you use cheaper lights, the sensor is not really going to be recording the most accurate colors. Most lights on the market today have colorimetry data for you to reference in color and exposure critical work. Now I understand this is very nitpicky, but if all else fails, the best color you will get will always be the sun or a tungsten light. Using the waveform monitor is by no means a hard and fast rule. You have zebras, you have false color, you have your instinct. I like waveform monitor because I'm a visual learner and I like to see the actual density of my image. You may disagree with my approach, and man, that is totally fine. The straightest path to the truth is doing your own tests and coming up with your own methods. Let's quickly recap. Overexposing by 1 to 3 stops, depending on your camera, will most often yield you better shadow control and a cleaner image via a dense negative. You're also going to want to build compensation LUTs for monitoring on set so your clients don't fire you. I recommend also adjusting exposure with your lighting, neutral density, lens, or shutter. Only change your ISO if you want to affect the dynamic range above or below middle gray. And finally, test each camera that you use to make sure that you are getting the results that you are happy with. Don't blindly trust me, there are far too many variables. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please subscribe to this channel for more videos like this and comment in the comment section below because, I know you have a lot to say. For me, for now, for today, I'm out. Peace.